We're very lucky to have with us live in the studios this morning Professor John Marzluff. Professor John Marzluff is a Denman Professor of Sustainable Resource Sciences and a Professor of Wildlife Science in the College of Forest Resources at the University of Washington. He has authored over 100 scientific papers on various aspects of bird behavior and wildlife management. He is a member of the Board of Editors for Bird Behavior. He has edited Avian Conservation, Research and Management, that includes 40 chapters detailing research approaches to conserve avian biodiversity throughout the world, Avian Conservation and Ecology in an Urbanizing World, and Radiotelemetry and Animal Populations. He is currently the leader of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's recovery team for the critically endangered Mariana crow. He recently served as the National Academy of Science as an advisor for the team to assess the scientific basis for the recovery of the Mariana crow. And he is here to talk about his book, which he co-authored with Tony Angel, In the Company of Crows and Ravens. Start out and tell us, what was the motivation in writing your book, In the Company of Crows and Ravens?
Well, the motivation was really to try to communicate to people the way in which we interact with a really common animal, the American crow in particular. And when Tony and I set out to think about, what would we tell people about crows and that they didn't probably already know, we just came with this large accumulation of little facts, and they didn't really hang together in a very interesting way with respect to just a biography of the crow. But what really hung them together was this interaction between people and crows and how long this interaction has been, really from the dawn of our time through the present. And the influence of these birds on us is quite striking. And then what we came to realize, really, and motivated us to finish the book, was that we have had an equal influence on crows. And it's really been this back and forth interaction that kind of motivated us to put this information out in a new way.
So maybe back up a step. Tell us when is it that you became interested in crows and ravens?
Well, I became interested in crows and ravens when I was a grad student in the 1980s, and I was studying jays, which are close relatives, same family of birds as crows and ravens, the corvids. And I was watching a pinyon jay nest, studying their parental behavior, how they were taking care of their young and how often they were feeding them and cleaning the nest. And I just about had the last bit of data on this nest, and a crow comes screaming in and eats the babies right in front of me. And so I stepped out and was screaming, yelling at the crow to get the heck out of the nest because I was losing my data. And I thwarted that predation event, which I shouldn't have done. I should have just let it go and let nature take its course. And that's my mantra from now on, is that I do that. But it was difficult to sit and watch it. So I became interested. How'd those birds find the nest? Would they come back if they didn't get all the young? And about half of the nests you study as a bird biologist end up getting eaten by something. And so this was an important predator in my system. And I was fortunate at that time, just finishing up my PhD, that Bern Heinrich, who is a professor at Vermont, came and visited us in Arizona and talked about some new work he was doing on ravens and how they were communicating with each other about where hidden foods were during the wintertime of Maine, the winter of Maine and Vermont, the very snowy, pretty isolated country up there. And so we got to know Bernd and decided, well, we should pursue crows and ravens, and really particularly ravens, for about the next 4 years in Maine, and understand how they would communicate with one another and tell each other basically where the next dead moose was that one bird might find, but many could share. So we got sucked off onto this path of bigger corvids, basically, by following Bernd and studying ravens. And then I moved to Idaho, and ravens and crows were, again, a common feature there. And it's the kind of bird that once you start looking at their behavior, it's so complex and variable and interesting that you just stick with it. You really don't want to go and study a bird that has a less variable behavioral repertoire after you've started to look at crows or ravens or jays. So I continue to do that today.
So here in the greater Seattle area, do we have both crows and ravens?
We do have both crows and ravens here. Almost any bird you see in the city, a black bird, is going to be a crow. But there are ravens that cruise by. As you get towards the Olympics or towards the Cascades, you become inundated more and more with ravens and less with crows. And at that interface, say the Monroe area, if you're going east, or Issaquah, you'll start to get a mixture of crows and ravens. But most of the birds that are in on our streets that you interact with daily Close up are going to be crows here, and those that are flying more distantly, quirking, cawing, deep hoarse caws as they fly over are going to be ravens.
And my impression is that crows are a very smart bird. Is that true?
Yes, all the corvids, the jays, nutcrackers, magpies, crows, and ravens are all really smart birds. And the reason we say this is because if you just physically measure them, their brain size is much larger than it should be based upon simply their body size. So there's a general relationship between body size and brain size in animals. You know, ants have small brains and elephants have big brains. But where do they sit on the relative curve of their particular group of organisms? Well, if you look at the curve for birds, as brain size increases, ostriches, which are big birds, have pretty small brains. But crows and parrots are smaller birds, but they have very big brains for their body size. And they can solve lots of problems. They use this as an adaptation. They can make tools if they need to probe into crevices and get out hard-to-get foods. Or they can use insight in looking at a situation and figuring out, if I pull this string, this particular door will open and food will come out. Or I can pull up a fisherman's line if it's in the ice on a frozen lake and secure their bait or their trophy that way.
All right. And how do they get most of their information? Is it through primarily their eyes? Do they also use like their the sense of smell and hearing? Yeah,
that's a good question. It's not really well known, of course, because it's hard to put yourself into this kind of the mystique of another animal like this. But certainly eyes are very important. They have big nerve centers associated with their eyes in their brains. So I think of them as primarily visual. Some of the corvids also can smell fairly well. Magpies, for example, have a good sense of smell, and they can find hidden foods, rotten foods, which they specialize on as well, by the sense of smell. But crows and ravens, they don't seem to have a very good sense of smell. They have a much better sense of sight. And you can see it, especially with a raven. If you're out in a road, say on the Olympic Peninsula, even Highway 101, each morning, a pair of ravens that has the territory along the road you're on will fly right down that road, and they'll be a couple hundred meters up, and they're just scanning from side to side looking. And as soon as they see the slightest thing, one Cheeto on the road, they'll circle and wham, they're right down to get it. So they're always looking, but they also listen. We know that if you play recordings of other birds feeding, other crows or ravens feeding, you'll attract many more in. So they're very acutely tuned in, I think, to the auditory environment they're in, especially their own calls, their species calls, and others that reliably indicate food or danger. And they're also looking for things. Another good example of the kind of auditory use is ravens have learned to associate gunshots, in the wilderness setting at least, with potential foods. And if you go out and shoot a gun, like you perhaps were hunting a deer, a raven will come in to that gunshot, and they'll wait and look, and if it's indeed a hunter who will then open up a carcass, take the meat that they want, and leave the rest, the raven will be right there on the front door, so to speak, to be able to get that food.
Interesting. And compare that with, let's say, crows in the cities where, or even in the rural areas where gunshots would seem to indicate people shooting at them.
Excellent point. And crows are a legally hunted species in most states, including Washington, which I know seems kind of strange, but because they're smart, they're also very wary. And because they pay attention to these noises and the actions, they're very wary, and they learn to stay away from dangerous situations like a potential crow hunter in this case. And so, yes, they'll listen to that. They'll stay away from calls like that. They'll also come in and learn, I think, about the situation where the hunting is occurring. And this is something we've been very interested in, is how they discriminate among good and bad people, basically, in their environment. So a hunter, in this case, with a gun, is a good person in the environment if you live even as a crow in the rural area, say around Forks, Washington, in the forestry zone, basically. There, a gunshot could mean food, and you should come in and check it out. If you live perhaps out where I do, in the Woodinville-Maltby area, a gunshot there means somebody's probably shooting at a crow. And there are a lot of crow hunting that occurs out there. And the birds that come into that, if they're not shot, they need to learn what place to avoid. So they need to come in close enough upon hearing this potentially dangerous signal to learn to avoid it, and also to see if there's a particular person who is perpetrating the crime, in this case, shooting at them. And this they do by coming in and being very alert, perhaps listening to the alarm calls of other crows or other species that are in the area, and then coming in and looking, I think, at that case. So maybe attracted to the sound and then using vision to survey this situation and learn the characteristics of the face of the person holding the gun. And then recognizing that person and avoiding them anytime they see them, whether they're with or without a gun, basically.
Now, and do they have the ability then to pass that information on to other crows?
It sure looks like it. Maybe I should describe these experiments a little bit. But what we have done to try to understand, first, can they discriminate among people that may be good and bad? And second, do they pass that information on, is that we have to routinely catch the birds ourselves to band them, to tag them and measure them, just so that we can. The main thing we want to do is keep up with a particular individual over its lifetime, to see the experiences that it has and how it uses those experiences to better live in its environment, basically, and reproduce. So that's what we're interested in. So we catch a bird with a net, and we do this by luring them into some food and then shooting a remote-controlled net over them, and it pins them down to the ground. It doesn't hurt them. It doesn't seem to us, at least, to hurt them when that happens. But I'm sure it's a shocking and a stressful experience for them. So we quickly rush up there, grab the bird. We wear a mask in a particular experiment so that they see that as the face of the person that catches them. And we've had a variety of masks, from cartoonish caveman masks to Dick Cheney to people's faces that we work with every day that we've had masks made of. And we use those when we catch the birds. We then band them and let them go. And it's a process that takes a particular bird out of its system for about 10 minutes. And then they're on their own again, and everything seems okay as far as we can tell. Except that if we go back to that area with that mask on that we caught them with, they will come in and scold us and mob us and chase us and harass us to get us out of the area. So the degree to which they do that varies with the amount of persecution they've had by people in the past, but most of them are very aggressive. So, for example, downtown, where they're not shot at because of our laws prohibiting shooting, the birds will stoop on us. They will occasionally graze our head and hit us and chase us, and they're very aggressive and form a group of about 10 birds to mob us and get us out of the way when we wear that mask that we caught them with. Out in my neighborhood, where their birds are shot occasionally, they won't come within 100 meters typically of us, but they will scold. They'll be in the tops of the tall firs, alerting everybody else that there's a dangerous person there, stay away from it, and learn who that dangerous person is. And it's this bringing them in and scolding and having others come in response to that call, and then looking at us with the dangerous face on, that we think is the way they pass on this information. And they basically, an individual that doesn't know who's dangerous in the area, all they have to do is listen to a scolding vocalization that occurs, come in and look, see who the animal that's scolding is paying attention to, and from that interaction, they should be able to absorb basically the information that, oh, that's a dangerous person here. I'll remember that, I'll avoid that, and I'll even scold that person next time. So on campus, where we can see this pretty clearly, we caught birds about almost 3 years ago now, 2.5 years ago, and we wore a mask of a caveman when we did this. And the birds on campus, we caught 7 individuals and banded them and let them go. And immediately after we did this, the birds would scold that mask, and they'd never scolded it before we caught the birds. They don't scold us if we just walk without the mask or if we walk with a different mask. So it's the particular face that we wear that they scold. And now on campus, almost every bird you encounter, 2.5 years later, every bird you encounter will scold you with that mask on. And we only caught 7 birds 2.5 years ago. So this is a long-lasting memory of a bad event. And the fact that more and more birds have scolded us through time indicates that they are learning it not by their individual experience, because otherwise we would have had 7 birds scolding us through time and that was it. Instead, the birds could have learned it 2 ways. They could have learned it by observing us catch those 7, which some certainly did, because when you disturb birds like that, they will come in and look at you, fly around, and give an alarm call at that time as well. So some of them learned it then. But it's been increasing still over that 2 years after that event. And so some may have learned it by watching others scold us. And that's really this social learning. And that really allows the idea that Tony and I were talking about in this book to occur, and that is a culture or a tradition of a particular behavior evolving socially in a population. And that would be the ability or the knowledge that this particular caveman that walks on campus every once in a while is bad. And that knowledge has spread socially through the population. And there's now a tradition on the University of Washington campus for crows to scold people who wear a caveman mask. And that's something that is adaptive on campus because a long time ago, that person caught some birds. But it's not adaptive outside of campus, and I can wear a caveman mask, anywhere else around Seattle, and the crows won't pay any attention to me. But on campus, they have a tradition now of hating that mask. And it's this ability of them to form a tradition in response to a human activity that I think allows our cultures really to co-evolve. And so their culture of hating us, a socially learned behavior, is what biologists think of as a cultural trait that occurs in a population if it occurs there and not somewhere else, like this hating the mask does. That culture has evolved in response to an interaction with people. Our culture could also evolve by interacting with crows. On campus, people are really interested in crows because they see banded crows there. They know about some of the work we do. And so they're more in tuned and interested. And so the culture of the University of Washington students is probably to be more interested in crows than, say, the culture of students at the University of Illinois, for example. And so this kind of behavioral repertoire that we have as a species is influenced by our interaction with a bird who's also being influenced by their interaction with us.
Interesting. So the birds there on the University of Washington campus, do they tend to stay in that area? There's no passing of that knowledge on to, let's say, birds in the University District or Fremont or something?
Well, you've anticipated the next phase of our research because that's exactly what we have to do next month. Is we'll start now, just as a warning, anybody who lives close around there, if you see a guy walking around with a caveman mask on, don't be alarmed. We're just looking at crows. And we have to go out and see how far it has spread because the birds do disperse, absolutely. And we know that young birds born on campus, they could be living anywhere in the Puget Sound region, really. And whether they will carry that information on is something we're really curious about, and we're just getting ready to test. I suspect they will, but we won't know until we get scolded by a bird a couple of miles or so off of campus.
So in addition to scolding, are there other ideas or that are passed on from bird to bird, like positive things, like, for instance, if somebody feeds a bird?
Yes, absolutely. We focus on the negative thing because it's easy to do. It's part of what we have to do for our research anyway, is catch the birds. So it was an easy thing for us to do. But the positive reinforcement is very strong. And I've gotten stories and have interacted with many people in our region here and around the U.S. that take great pleasure in feeding crows because they do form a very tight social bond with that animal. And there's a guy in my neighborhood that feeds about 30 or 40 crows a day, and they will follow him around when he leaves his driveway. A small black horde will be right above him and around him, waiting for a peanut or two to drop. I've seen lots of folks on campus and also around Seattle that do the same thing. And again, that's part of this exact same relationship. It's interesting for people because the crows are very responsive to them. And it's interesting for the crows because they get a reward out of it. And so there's this strong mutual attraction, almost like having a dog, beside you, but it's a wild animal. So they're still doing their own wild thing, but they're using us for what they need, in this case, food. It may take a little longer for that relationship to form, but it certainly does form and is absolutely as strong as the negative one and as long-lasting. As long as, in this case, some food is coming out of the person that's walking around with them, those birds will be right there. And I imagine even for a lot longer. There was a case in Bellevue of a school bus driver who fed crows also every day when she would come to work. And they would follow her and became a nuisance because they would follow her to the parking lot of all the school buses and rip on the rubber and poop all over the buses and that sort of thing. So she had to stop that behavior. And it took months, probably a year, before those birds would stop following her and anticipating. Again, if you want to think of it kind of anthropomorphically, put us into their position, they were anticipating, thinking about a reward that was going to come because they had gotten it so often from this particular person. And it takes a long time for that behavior to extinguish. That kind of thing, I think, is also really part of why these animals were so important to early people. And the native cultures in the Northwest in particular, as you know, are strongly influenced by crows and ravens. They're viewed as a creator or a trickster, a very important totem for people of the northern Pacific coast. And this is, I think, one of the main reasons why is because you can just imagine sitting around the camp, 20,000 years ago and being surrounded by crows and ravens. And those birds would be trying to get food from the people. And the people would probably also be enjoying that interaction with those birds who would come close enough and be interesting enough in looking at them in inquisitive ways and with postures that you could interpret very easily. And have this bond formed with a very early person and a wild animal in this case that would be unlike a lot of the other interactions with a deer or an elk, for example. Probably much more similar to the interaction with a wolf that would have, eventually led perhaps to domestication of a dog. In this case, we never quite domesticated a crow or raven, but we certainly fantasized about them, and we certainly thought about how they might have really started the whole thing off for us.
Any sense for their vocabulary and if there's like definitive words or meanings to things?
Yeah, the vocabulary of birds is studied a great deal, and the crow and raven work that's been done often goes unpublished because it's so complex. We know an awful lot about, let's say 20 common calls that are given that mean things from, help to danger to food to fly away to come in. All these sorts of meanings are quite easy to see in the basic repertoire. But what makes it complex for crows and ravens and jays is that each call has an individual signature to it. So you can not only tell what they're saying, but who said it. They vary the pitch from a very aggressive, deep voice if they're upset at something to a high-pitched call, perhaps, if they're really afraid of something. So there's lots of layered meanings to each call besides the basic message. So I think it's much more complex than just a word, kind of each call meaning a particular word. But how those calls are intonated makes a big difference. How they're linked up with one another, given in sequence, so the syntax of them, which is a property of our language, makes a big difference to crows and ravens. So they have all the rudimentary aspects of a true language, particular meanings that are context dependent, that are that can be changed by rearranging the order in which they're given. All of those things imply that it's a true language, like a human language, but it's certainly much less complex than ours. But it's an awfully good model, I think, to study also human language in this case.
And did I read in your book that body language even plays a part in this? The
posturing of birds, I was indicating that you can read their emotion quite easly by looking at a crow or a raven, and I think that's because they use postures much like we do. They fluff up their feathers to look bigger if they want to appear more aggressive. They sleek them down if they want to hide and melt into the shadows to be a more subordinate animal. They raise particular feathers around their head. What we call with a raven, they have their ears up and their pants down. They lower the feathers along their legs if they want to look really aggressive and macho. So they change their feather posturing quite dramatically, and also the physical posturing. They'll crouch, they'll beg, they'll cower, they'll roll over on their backs if they're scratching or playing in the snow. So they have a lot of different postures and positions that you see commonly that are pretty easy to interpret given their interaction with the other animals. One that I see most commonly, I think, in Seattle is a bird perched up on a telephone pole, and it will, a crow in this case, giving a territorial set of caws, and it will bend down and arch up, and each caw, like a pump handle you can kind of hear as you're listening to it. And that movement of the body gives that voice a different inflection and a bit of a different power, I'm sure, and meaning probably to those that hear it.
See, now I'd actually like a cheat sheet on that so
Yeah,
I can figure out what the crows are saying at different times or what one thinks they are. And I've heard from friends that they also appear to have the ability to mimic specific sounds. Is that true?
That's true. They can mimic a human voice. There are crows at lots of zoos and nature centers that will say hello or goodbye or how are you doing. Philadelphia, there was a famous crow that would say, "Hey, bro, what's happening?" And there are ravens that can say just about anything. I've heard them say "nevermore." The most fabulous story, and you never know how true these stories are, but this one comes from Konrad Lorenz, who was a Nobel laureate animal behaviorist in the 40s and 30s. And what Lorenz found was he was taking care of a friend's crow, hooded crow, he's European, and the bird escaped, came back with a broken leg. And instead of just, cowering around when it came back, it said, "Caught him in the bloomin' trap," indicating that it had been caught in a trap by a trapper, and that's probably what the guy said when it came up to the bird. But the ability of these birds to use our language or another sound in an appropriate context like that to imply to the owner, in this case, what had happened to him. He could have said meow in that case, but he didn't. That really strikes hard at you, and you really wonder, wow, how much do these animals really know, and how much do they really try to convey to those they're interacting with?
Another thing I've observed is crows obviously in the middle of the road, picking through roadkill, but I believe that they actually have figured out how to drop things into the road to get the cars to open them up for them.
Yeah, that's true. In Japan, the crows there take walnuts, and this is a really good example of this overall theme of coevolution between people and crows. So people brought in walnuts. The crows started using walnuts there because they were growing as a new species there. They couldn't open the nuts, so they started dropping them on the road and eventually perching at the stop signals, the traffic light signals in Tokyo, and flying down at a red light and putting the walnut in front of the stopped car, then flying back up, not waiting. The light changes, the car runs over the nut, then they fly back down and eat the open nut, in this case, walnut, which they couldn't open otherwise. So they're using, one, a food that we brought in, two, a vehicle that we've developed, all to get their food. And they've done this in a very elaborate, interesting way, and it has spread slowly, socially, like we might expect the memory of the caveman to spread off a campus. It's spread a couple of kilometers in 20 or 30 years around this area where it started in Tokyo. So they're very acutely aware of us and how to use our technology to their advantage. But that's also influenced us. I talked to the researchers there, and people in Tokyo now are very interested in this, and they make sure when they drive to run over the nut as well. So they've given some positive reinforcement back to this interesting behavior that's reinforcing their driving. So it's this circular kind of back and forth, in this case in a positive way, perhaps also in hunting in a negative way, to learn to avoid people that we find so fascinating really with these animals.
I might be mixing this up with another bird, but I thought I had read recently that they had a problem in Japan, or they perceived problem with a lot of crows that they're getting worried about.
Yeah, so again, you have to discriminate among people if you're a crow in Japan, because while some will try to do anything they can to run over the nut for you, it's a significant fraction of the human population there that's had it with crows, because there are too many of them in the city for them. They rip up the garbage. And they've forced the evolution of human garbage maintenance in Tokyo, because now people, instead of just piling garbage on the street, which was a bonanza for crows, they put it in special bags, they put nets over them. They'll probably start putting them in containers like we do much more there because of this interaction with crows. But yeah, it's a good point. On one hand, when an animal is kind of rare and doing neat behaviors, we really love it, and we're by it. Then it gets so good at doing these things, like some crows can, that we become bothered and we view them as a pest and we want to get rid of them. And that's what's going on in Tokyo.
All right. Well, unfortunately, I still have a lot of questions, but we're pretty much out of time. So I want to thank you very much for spending time with us this morning.
My pleasure. Thanks, Mike.